Okay,
Okay,
there we
gotcha.
go. Okay, so just for the second recording then, hi everyone. Welcome to this session on the key Azure announcements that were presented at Ignite 2022, just a few weeks ago. My name is Sven Aelterman, and I'm a cloud solution architect working at Microsoft for the US education organization here. And while I'll give a little bit of introduction as to who I am and what my background is, I wanted to make sure that I was also clear about what I mean by key Azure announcements. So it's really me going through the Azure announcements and filtering it and prioritizing it for the information that is most relevant for what I believe the customers who I am working with. And so hopefully some of that will apply to you as well. And I think you'll find value in that. If you're looking for the entire slate of announcements from Ignite 2022, so outside of Azure as well, then you can visit the Ignite 2022 Book of News. You can Bing or Google for that keyword, and that'll pull it right up. Like I said, I'll just briefly introduce myself. I joined Microsoft about 2.5 years ago now. Prior to joining Microsoft, I served as Director of IT for the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University in Alabama. Also served as Cloud Architect for an organization affiliated with the university. I also served as a lecturer, and prior to Troy University, I was a consultant and IT manager. If you'd like to get in touch and follow me, I welcome connections on LinkedIn, but please provide a short message showing or referencing, that you saw me, for example, in the Nashville Microsoft Azure users group. And if Twitter's still up and running tomorrow, you can follow me there as well. And I've had the opportunity to co-author a few books related to SQL Server, The Art of SQL Server FileStream, which was published about 10 years ago this year, and then more recently SQL Server Inside Out 2017 and 2019 editions. But I think that's enough about me. So let's jump right into these key announcements from Ignite. And I'll begin with key announcements around Azure infrastructure. That's going to be really the vast majority of what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I also have a few announcements that are related to security. And frankly, the data and AI announcements were a little light in Azure. But the PaaS Summit 2022 is going on this week, and there have been a few announcements related to SQL Server there, and I've squeezed a few of those in at the very end of the presentation. So you can consider that bonus content for this evening, and it will be on the test too. So let's go right in. Again, remember, this is me filtering through the announcements and kind of bubbling up what I believe is a major announcement or probably very important. And I found really that the most important one relates to the Azure Monitor Agent. And there were a few announcements made at Ignite around the Azure Monitor Agent, although the AMA, as we abbreviate Azure Monitor Agent, by itself isn't necessarily new or a new announcement. But it's important enough to really talk about it a little bit in depth. So the AMA is the new agent that is on its way to replace the legacy monitoring agents. And they have been, referred to as the Microsoft Monitoring Agent or the Log Analytics Agent, or even OMS, which is really a kind of a holdover from the on-prem days. And that agent is set to deprecate in August of 2024. And that's nearing. We still have some time to migrate, but that time frame is shortening. And so it's time to start making plans to migrate your monitoring of your Azure infrastructure and your hybrid infrastructure from the MMA to the AMA. Now, conceptually, the MMA and the AMA are actually a little bit different. So the MMA was a standalone installation. It's an MSI file on Windows that you can download and deploy. And it's not really connected to anything else. And it's the same installer, same agent that you would deploy on Azure VMs, on other cloud VMs, or on-prem. The Azure Monitor Agent, on the contrary, is an extension for Azure virtual machines. And it is based on either Azure Arc being enabled on your hybrid servers, so on-prem or in other clouds, or being an Azure VM, which already has the Azure Guest Agent installed. So the AMA acts as an extension. Similarly to, for example, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint can act as an extension on your Azure VMs. Hey, Bill, I'm sorry, just a quick check. My screen is still being shared, right? I'm going to assume that's a yes. If not, please speak up. If I'm not sharing my screen, it doesn't actually look like I am, but I suppose it's good. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Thank you, Julia. Let me try that again. I was under the impression that I was sharing the screen. So, okay, how's that?
Yep, there I see it.
Nope. Wait, hang on. I just realized I'm sharing the wrong screen though, because all you see is a background.
That was the Azure Monitor Agent screen.
There we go. Okay. No, still. Wow, that's interesting. Okay.
Says Azure Monitor Agent.
Oh, you did?
I saw it.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. All right. Sorry. Clearly, I'm used to working with Teams more than with Zoom.
Right. It looks good.
There's some odd behavior on my display where it made it seem as if it was one of my other screens that was being shared. But if we're in business, then I'm just going to continue now. So as I was talking about the Azure Monitor Agent and the fact that it's time to begin planning your migration from the legacy agent, the Microsoft monitoring agent, to the AMA, and talk a little bit about the fact that AMA acts as an extension. So for your on-prem VMs and VMs in other clouds, what that means is that you're actually going to have to also deploy Azure Arc. And that's important because when you're doing migration planning, you're going to have to take that into account. Right? It's no longer simply a matter of deploying a standalone piece of software. Now, what was announced at Ignite is that migration tooling is now available. And what I've done is I've taken this image at the bottom, this diagram at the bottom from our documentation on that. And it details the 4 steps that you need to take to start your migration and be successful on that. It's important to understand that while I'm saying you should begin planning your migration now, you should probably be testing the Azure Monitor Agent, it is important to recognize that not all functionality and services from the Microsoft Monitoring Agent are available in the Azure Monitor Agent yet. Okay. So some of the features are currently in private or public preview, and some others will be, entering private and public previews in the next few months. So keep that in mind as well. And the other announcement from Ignite relating to the Azure Monitor Agent is about a Windows client installer. And that is important because, as I mentioned before, the MMA, the legacy agent, is an installer, an MSI file, and you were always able to install that on Windows clients. However, the Azure Monitoring Agent being an extension, if you want to put that on a Windows client, desktop, laptop that's around in your environment, you cannot deploy Arc to those operating systems, to those client operating systems. So in order to allow you to still collect data, logs, metrics, etc., from some of these systems, which can be very important for some compliance purposes, perhaps, you need a Windows client installer. And so the standalone Windows client installer is now available as well. So that, I think, is probably not the highlight of Ignite, but because it's so important for those of you who are actively using Azure Monitor to collect logs, metrics from all your systems, this is really key. The message is start migration planning. Okay, now as we're talking about Azure Monitor and the Azure Monitor agent, which of course is a key part of that, there were a few other announcements related to Azure Monitor as well that I think are worth mentioning. The first one is that we now have the capability in Azure Monitor to support table level role-based access control. What do I mean by that? So in Azure Monitor, the data is stored in log analytics workspaces. Log analytics workspaces, in a very crude analogy, are essentially databases. And they collect all kinds of different data, anything from Azure native data to syslog data from Linux machines or appliances to Windows security event data and so on. And the different data types that are collected in a single log analytics workspace will end up in different tables that each have their own schema, meaning the columns, the data types that are collected from or based on each type of data. And until recently, when you needed to allow people to access the log analytics workspace, they would have access to read all the contents in that log analytics workspace. But it's important to recognize that that's not always desirable. You don't want to have a sprawl of log analytics workspaces. Now, more than likely, you'll probably end up having more than one. It's not feasible, probably in a large, certainly a large Azure deployment, to just have a single log analytics workspace. But you don't need to go and create a different log analytics workspace for every single new workload that you're going to deploy. Certainly not when it comes to integrating, for example, with Microsoft Sentinel and you start collecting security data, right? You want that to be as centralized as possible. Now, with that being said, if you have log analytics workspaces, just a few of them in your environment, they'll be collecting lots of different information. Some information may contain, or some tables in these log analytics workspaces may therefore end up containing some sensitive information that you may not want everyone to see. But yet, some of those people may be people who are responsible for the operation of an application, have a legitimate need to see the log files that are being produced by the Azure resources that host that application, maybe even by application insights and so on. So now, by enabling role-based access control at the table level in log analytics workspaces, we allow you to more granularly assign these kinds of permissions. Okay, so that is interesting. That is important. That is big. The other thing that was announced is recommended alert rules, and recommended alert rules are designed to make it easier for deploying new workloads to have alerts set up that, again, are recommended, right? So that makes sense for that workload. And over time, I feel pretty certain that, most of our users are still going to continue to create some custom alert rules that is really based on the knowledge that they have about their workload and about their environment. But when you just first start to deploy a workload, you may not have necessarily all of the information. And so by beginning with deploying recommended alert rules, you can get a head start on making sure that your environment, that we're not just collecting data through Azure Monitor, but that we also provide you with actionable alerts when something seems to be off. And so it's all about increasing the time or I should say actually decreasing the time it takes to manage your environment. Now, there's one thing that I think I neglected to say when I initially started the presentation, so I'm going to mention it right now. You know, while I work for Microsoft, while I work with Azure on a daily basis, it's important to make clear that what I'm talking about here today is entirely my own opinion and is not necessarily reflective of Microsoft's opinions or anyone else at working at Microsoft. So when I talk about what I think is important and very relevant, this literally just Sven Aelterman making these statements. So the last announcement from Ignite 2022 that I wanted to highlight is Managed Prometheus. And for those of you who perhaps are familiar with running Kubernetes, you might recognize that Prometheus is a tool set that allows you to very effectively collect metrics. And certainly not just limited to Kubernetes, but it seems to me at least that Prometheus has the biggest presence when managing and monitoring Kubernetes clusters, including Azure Kubernetes Service or AKS. Now, managing or running Prometheus requires that you set up infrastructure to run the collection and the data storage that is required for Prometheus to work and to provide alerting and areas like that and functionality like that. So what we've announced now, and this is in preview, is a managed Prometheus solution. So it essentially takes away the overhead of having to manage the infrastructure to set up your own Prometheus instance to collect metrics, data from your deployments, and then alerting on that and visualizing that perhaps. A great combination, of course, is combining managed Prometheus services with managed Grafana, right? That's a great combination of tools that are available. Okay, I think that about wraps up the key announcements for Azure Monitor. So I think we'll move on and talk about DNS. And DNS is everyone's problem, because if it doesn't work right, all sorts of things are affected. And here, a key announcement has been the general availability. It was in preview for a few months, but the general availability of the Azure Private DNS Resolver. What this essentially signifies is that you now have an Azure service that can act as a DNS forwarder without you having to manage, again, the operating system, the DNS software, or any other items related to that. And Azure DNS Private Resolver comes generally with two capabilities. And I realize as I'm going through this conversation that I've probably listed them in the wrong order in terms of importance. I think that most of our customers will probably be most interested in what I've listed here as the second use case. So I'll talk about it first here. What this Azure DNS Private Resolver is able to do is to accept DNS queries that are forwarded from your on-premises infrastructure. And why is that important? Well, the common use for this is private endpoints in Azure. I'm not sure how familiar people here are with private endpoints, so I'll provide a very high-level introduction. A private endpoint is a way to reach an Azure platform service via a private IP address. So an IP address that exists in one of your virtual networks in Azure. Specific example and a very common use case is Azure Storage. So instead of accessing your storage account, and whether that's blob storage or table storage, queue, any of the endpoints, including file storage as well, any of those endpoints, instead of accessing them using a public endpoint, which if you're coming in from on-premises would probably traverse the internet, you will be able to access the private endpoint, like I said, using a private IP address. And then you will traverse from on-premises to Azure over either a site-to-site VPN connection or an express route, or potentially, I suppose, also a point-to-site connection. So that keeps traffic off the public internet, which is a use case that is important, very commonly for compliance reasons. And there's certainly other reasons to use private endpoints as well than just compliance. And now, enabling private endpoints has a distinct requirement to also configure DNS. And the reason for that is that the platform service, and again, I'll use storage accounts as an example, the platform service, the endpoint is generally addressed using a DNS name, a fully qualified DNS name. So in the context of a storage account, I might, if I have called my storage account 1, then the blob endpoint would be storage account 1.blob.core.windows.net. And with that comes a TLS certificate to enable HTTPS. Now, in order then for me to be able to access that endpoint, I cannot change the DNS name, right? If I change the DNS name, the certificate is going to be considered invalid. So I need to do two things. I need to be able to resolve the public DNS name of that storage account or any other platform service. And then I need to translate that into a private IP address in one of my VNets. Now, there's really a number of ways to solve that problem, but the primary way in which I see customers and in which I recommend customers to do this is to conditionally forward DNS queries from on-premises to an Azure private DNS zone. And so an Azure private DNS zone will hold the A records for a DNS zone that is going to have private link in the name. So for a storage account, going back to the same example as before, the storage account's name in that private DNS zone would be something like storage account 1.privatelink.blob.core.windows.net. I'm trying to make sure I say all the elements of the FQDN in the right order.
Hey, Sven, we've got a quick question. Someone is asking if it's in preview.
Oh, so Azure DNS Private Resolver. Yeah, so Azure DNS Private Resolver is currently generally available. Yeah, so that was the announcement at Ignite, general availability of the DNS Private Resolver. Yeah, thanks for asking, Nola. So when we have that DNS zone set up, we now have mapped that alias for that storage account name to a private IP address. But Azure private DNS zones require that the request for DNS resolution is coming from a trusted VNet. And so if your infrastructure runs in Azure, that's not a problem. But if your query is coming from on-prem, that is where you have a problem, because there is no way for the Azure private DNS zone to authenticate that the query, that the request for the name resolution, right, is coming from an authenticated source. So what we do, therefore, like I said earlier, is we take our on-prem DNS servers, configure conditional forwarding for these DNS zones, for these private link DNS zones, and send those up into Azure. Once we're up into Azure, we can then configure a DNS forwarder that can authenticate, so to speak, and I use authenticate loosely here, but can authenticate to the private DNS zone by virtue of the fact that it lives in an Azure virtual network. And so traditionally, what our customers have done was set up a Windows DNS server in Azure to act as the forwarder, or a Linux flavor of DNS to set up as a forwarder. And again, what does that mean? You have infrastructure to manage, right? You have an operating system to maintain. You have a DNS service to maintain. And so the private DNS resolver that is now generally available, what it does is it alleviates the need of doing that, and you simply create an instance of this service, drop it into your virtual network, which gives you the endpoint IP address that you need to send your on-prem queries to, so that you can successfully resolve these private endpoints. So that was probably about a 5-minute explanation, but in order to truly grasp the significance of what DNS Private Resolver offers, right, it's important to understand, I think, this use case of private endpoints. Again, there's other use cases potentially as well, but I think the most common one that we're going to see is for resolving private endpoints. Now, it also works the other way around. It can also take your queries that originate from your Azure infrastructure or your Azure services, and then forward them to your on-premises infrastructure. Overall, I think that's probably a less common use case. Many customers have already deployed DNS solutions in Azure that essentially contain copies of their on-prem DNS zones. You know, certainly if you deploy Active Directory domain controllers in Azure, you know, that's a natural thing to do, to also deploy DNS with them and so on. But if you haven't done that yet, and if there are perhaps reasons not to do that, or perhaps you have some DNS zones on premises that are not part of your normal enterprise DNS infrastructure, you can use the private resolver to forward queries to on-prem DNS instances and DNS servers. Okay, so I think that's a pretty significant announcement, because again, as an infrastructure person, you know, that sounds kind of strange, I suppose, but the less infrastructure I have to manage, the better it is for me. So let's push off this responsibility to a managed service rather than managing operating systems and DNS services ourselves. And we can just focus on the configuration and the monitoring of the service. All right, moving on to the next topic, Azure Auto Manage. And again, this is now generally available. That was the announcement in at Ignite 2022. So Auto Manage, again, had been in preview for a while. And the entire concept behind Auto Manage is that you apply configuration profiles to your infrastructure in Azure. Virtual machines is what we're specifically talking about here. And configuration profiles are essentially preset configurations for a number of services, right, that kind of surround your virtual machines. So what can some of these services be? Backup, configuring Microsoft anti-malware, monitoring, baseline operating system configuration, so actually operating inside the operating system itself, update management, change tracking and inventory, configuring Defender for Cloud, setting up boot diagnostics on VMs, and now also, this is also generally available since Ignite, the Windows Admin Center, configuring Windows Admin Center, which of course, that only applies to Windows VMs. Most of the other capabilities apply to both Linux and Windows virtual machines. And so these configuration profiles are preset practices for using backup, for using anti-malware and the other services in your environment. But because we recognize, of course, that while we can provide you with these best practices, dev test often has a different set of practices and a different set of requirements than a production deployment. So out of the box, you get production and dev test configuration profiles. And then we also recognize that even those might not be suitable for all customers, or that customers, even if the prod and dev test profiles might be suitable for most of the infrastructure, that you want to have perhaps a customization capability for some of your infrastructure. So you can also create a configuration profile from scratch and granularly configure each of these services, again, that I've listed there on the slide. And the little screenshot, I know it must be an eye chart. If you're looking at it, the point wasn't really, you know, to be able to interpret what's on the screenshot, but it's just a list of services that Auto Manage configures and the different settings that are available in each service. So it just goes to indicate, you know, the capabilities and how much you can really push off to that service, because the point, of course, is that once you have these auto-managed profiles that you're going to deploy those to all your VMs, and you really don't have to think about backup and monitoring and update management separately, but you think of them as this management of this infrastructure is all covered by one service, and they all of my infrastructure is configured in a consistent way. That is what the point of auto-manage is. Another thing that was announced as part of the general availability announcement of auto-manage was the support for Windows 10 virtual machines. Now, when you're thinking about Azure infrastructure, I understand Windows 10 virtual machines may not be the first thing that you think about. You may be thinking about Windows Server 2019, Windows Server 2022, and any flavor of Linux that is supported in Azure. But when you think about Azure Virtual Desktop, and it'd be interesting to see, I don't know if attendees are able to show their hands, but if you're using Azure Virtual Desktop for your organization, if you are, there's a very good chance that you're running Windows 10 or certainly also Windows 11 client operating systems as part of those deployments. And so auto-manage can be used to configure those virtual machines as well. In addition to that, as part of our hybrid approach, we're also supporting Azure Arc-enabled servers. So you can take those same configuration profiles for, again, many of these services. Not all of them are applicable necessarily on-prem. Boot diagnostics, for example, is not something that on-premises is relevant, but many of those services can also be configured for Azure Arc-enabled servers. So your on-premises Linux and Windows servers and Linux and Windows servers in other clouds can all be managed in the same way. And finally, auto-manage is also the way in which hot patch for Windows Server Azure Edition, which currently is available for Server 2022. That was the first server version that had an Azure Edition, and so hot patch is part of that support. Now, what that means, of course, is that at the moment, hot patch is not something you can do on your on-premises or other cloud environments. And with on-premises, I think the exception there might be that if you run on an Azure Stack, it might be available. I'd have to double check on that to be able to say that with certainty, though. But to me, this is a great feature because, again, while we all are responsible for managing infrastructure and keeping it healthy and secure and available, right? It can be a lot of work to make sure that the whole environment is covered, and it's covered in a consistent way so that there are no surprises in case of an incident. And so I think this service auto-manage can greatly enhance that. And I think that's my colleague Joe here chiming in. It is available on Azure Stack HCI. So thank you, sir, for clarifying that. And I think his comment applies to what I was saying about hot patch for Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition. So thanks for chiming in there. I appreciate the feedback. All right, moving on. Here we're talking about money, right? And anything about money is, let me take one step back. I just see Nola's question coming in. The question that Nola has, does it have a dashboard or some user interface? And the answer, Nola, is yes, absolutely. You know, the little screenshot I took there was specifically about the details of one of the configuration profiles. But beyond that, yes, it does have a user interface where you can understand which machines are covered by auto-manage and you know, the state and things like that. It certainly does. Thanks for asking. Okay, back to money announcements here. You know, this was a very interesting announcement, and this is about Azure Savings Plan for Compute. And I didn't really mean to minimize the words for compute, but I couldn't fit the title on a single line otherwise. So you know, hopefully, you know, you'll keep in mind that this is for compute resources. And what this essentially is, Azure Savings Plan for Compute, is a way for you as a customer to get a discount on the compute hours that you consume when you commit to consuming a certain level. Now, many of you might be thinking, oh, well, that sounds a lot like reserved instances or reservations. And you're absolutely correct. There's certainly overlap there. So I thought that the best way to talk about a savings plan for compute would really be to kind of compare, right? How are they similar and how are they different? So on the table that's currently on the screen, I've listed a few of the elements that make up reserved instances and savings plans. And then I've said, okay, here's how this applies to reserved instance in the middle column. And on the right-hand column is the savings plan for compute information. So let's go through them one at a time. We'll start with the scope at which you apply these opportunities to reduce your compute expense. And so the scope in the Azure hierarchy could be shared, which would mean it's for the entire enrollment or the entire billing profile, depending on the kind of agreement you have with Microsoft. That would be shared, right? Or so it can be applied to a management group, to a subscription, or to a resource group. And so that's the same for both reserved instance and savings plan for compute support having an assignment or having that purchased at any level really in the Azure hierarchy. Now that's very important because I know many customers, they work right with organizations that are large and that each have their own budgets. And so you need to be able to account for, and in some cases charge back to those business units. And so if a business unit decides that they want to take advantage of either reserved instance or a savings plan for compute, right, you're going to have to make sure that the benefits of that purchase go to that particular unit. So that's why it's so important that these plans or these options for getting discounts apply at the appropriate level, and whatever, again, that appropriate level in your organization is, and so that works that way. Now, big difference though is there's another way to think about scope when you think about Azure, and that is the geographic region in which your resources are deployed. And so that's where we find the difference. When you purchase a reserved instance, you need to commit, and that reserved instance applies to a specific region at the time you purchase the reservation. However, with the savings plan for compute, there is no such requirement. So whichever compute is running in the scope of that savings plan, no matter which region it's running in, that compute is eligible for the discount that you acquire by committing to that savings plan. So that's a big difference. That's a big difference between the reserved instances and the savings plan. The commitment term is very similar. Generally, with reserved instance, you have 1 or 3 year commitment terms. There are very few, and I don't even know one of them by heart, but I have seen at least one, very few virtual machine SKUs where you can do a 5-year reservation. With the savings plan for compute, it's 1 or 3 years. So that's very similar. And then it's also important to understand what it is that you're actually committing to. And so with a reserved instance, it's actually quite defined. You're going to purchase a reserved instance for a particular virtual machine family. And within that family, it doesn't really matter if you deploy 1 4-core VM or 2 2-core VMs. That is fine. As long as you stay within that same family, that reserved instance can apply. Again, of course, within the context of the right region and the place in the Azure hierarchy. But that discount that you essentially purchase as a result of committing to reserved instances needs to be that specific service. So let's say virtual machines, and then within that specific service, you have to be running that particular VM family. Again, big contrast with savings plan for compute. Doesn't matter. Any eligible compute service for savings plan for compute, and I've got them listed a little bit lower on the slide, is automatically going to be eligible for it. So you don't, if you're running app services and you're running virtual machines, you don't need to start calculating, what can I commit to from a reserved instance perspective for app service, and what can I commit to from virtual machines? It's just one big pie, so to speak, of compute costs that are going to become eligible for a discount. When it comes to the flexibility, so again, when you commit to the reserved instance, you need to specify the specific virtual machine SKU, or for some of the other services, where reserved instances are possible, you got to be pretty specific. Now, there is a trade-in capability, and I'm not going to go into the specific details of the trading capabilities, but one thing that is very important to mention is that with the announcement of the Azure Savings Plan for Compute, and changes are coming to the flexibility that you have with reserved instances. Now, those flexibility changes to reserved instances aren't taking effect until January of 2024. So you have about, let's say, another year or so, but still very important to be aware of that. Then when it comes to the amount of discount percentage that you're going to get, with a reserved instance, the discount percentage is going to be higher. Now, sometimes the difference is literally a few percent, and sometimes the difference is quite significant. Okay, that all has to do with, again, the specific SKU and the specific service that you're purchasing the reserved instance for, or the savings plan for compute. What I will say is that the range of discount that you receive in the savings plan for compute is between about 11% and 65% on the very high end. Now, when we think about that is a very broad range, right? 11% and 65% is very big range. And so when you make a commitment to spend a minimum dollar amount on compute, and that is going to be actually expressed per hour, by the way. So you might say, hey, I'm gonna spend $5 per hour on compute, right? So it could be any compute service that is eligible for the savings plan. But within all of your compute, you might have some SKUs and some services that are providing you with a 30% discount, or a 50% discount, or a 65% discount, and there might be some other ones that only get you an 11% discount. So then the question becomes, well, which discount am I going to get? And so the answer is that we're looking out for your best interest, and we are going to apply the discounts first that are going to have the biggest impact. Right? Those are the discounts that are going to be applied first. Now, why am I talking about what gets applied first? Well, this is important because you might commit, like I said in the example before, to spending $5 per hour, right, for a period of 1 year, let's say. But that doesn't mean that that's your upper limit. You could be spending $6, $7, maybe more during peak periods. And at that point, whatever your spend is above what you've committed to, that is going to get charged at pay-as-you-go rates, right? So it's not like you're not going to be able to, of course, spin up additional services, but the discounts no longer apply because you didn't commit to spending that amount per hour, okay? And so what gets discounted first is very important, okay? And so you can also combine reserved instance. Well, I need to be careful when I say combine. You can't stack discounts for the same virtual machine two ways. But within your environment, you might be taking advantage of reserved instances and savings plans for compute. When you do that, it's important to understand that the reserved instance, if a VM is eligible for or matches the criteria, again, the hierarchy, the SKU, the region, etc. When a VM is eligible for the reserved instance, that is what's going to get applied first. Then whatever compute is left where no reserved instance discount has been applied yet, we'll be looking there, and again, this is entirely automatic for you, we'll be looking there for which of these remaining services are going to have the biggest impact on reducing your bill, and thus where the discount is going to get start getting applied. Okay, and then eventually, again, whatever overages, so to speak, there are, they'll just be charged at the pay-as-you-go rate. Okay, I feel like I've spent a lot of time on this already. You can probably tell I think this is great news for our customers because the flexibility that you get. It comes at a cost of a little bit lower discount compared to reserved instances, but I think it's still a fantastic thing because you don't have to really manage as much and not know as much what's going to happen in the next year or the next 3 years to your Azure environment to be able to take advantage of that savings plan. Then two final things I'll quickly add there with the billing frequency. So you might be aware of the fact that when you purchase a reservation, you can pay for the entire amount, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year amounts entirely upfront, or you can pay for it in equal monthly charges, and the total, right, is the same, right? If I had a reserved instance that would cost me $120 a year, right? I could choose to pay $120 upfront for a 1 year term, or I can still choose to pay $10 a month over those 12 months. And the same thing is true for the savings plan for compute. When I purchase the savings plan, I can choose whether I want to pay upfront for the entire 1 or 3 year term, or whether I want to be billed in monthly equal installments, so to speak. And again, without a financial penalty. So paying monthly, is not going to cost you more in the long run than paying it upfront. So it's entirely a decision that you probably want to make with your accountants in the organization to figure out which is the most beneficial for you. And both are really calculated on an hourly basis, right? So every hour, the Azure infrastructure, the Azure billing infrastructure is going to evaluate your usage and is going to, apply reserved instances and apply savings plans for compute. One thing, sometimes billing data can get a little bit delayed. So sometimes, according to our documentation, it could actually take up to 48 hours for all of the adjustments to compute savings plans that have been taking place. Again, remember, we evaluate which discount is most beneficial for you, and so that can take some time. If you're familiar with John Saville, he has a very nice YouTube channel, and he's done an interesting presentation about Azure Savings Plan for Compute that I would encourage everyone to check out. He's got some nice examples that he's worked out to really compare and contrast Savings Plan for Compute with reserved instance. I see Julia has given a thumbs up, so I'm thinking that's probably not for me, but that's for John Saville's YouTube channel, which is indeed fantastic. So great. Thanks, Julia. All right. Let's see. Well, let's move on a little bit. Actually, yes, one important thing. I'm glad I did this as a pop-up because I would have forgotten to talk about it. For a limited time, and I honestly don't know what the limited time is. Maybe we have already documented it. I didn't find it at first. You can actually trade in existing reserved instances and convert them in a way, but to a savings plan for compute. So that might be interesting for you if you feel like the rigidity that you have with reserved instances that might have sounded like a good idea 6 months ago or a year ago and is currently holding you back. Take advantage of that trade-in and maybe switch to savings plan for compute. And again, I'm not saying that that's the right move for everyone. I think in many organizations, many environments, there's probably room for a combination of reserved instances and savings plans for compute, depending on the exact needs. But that's an option today that will be available only for a limited time. Okay, now we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the stack. We've been talking about Azure infrastructure very broadly. Now we're going to take a dive into one of the most foundational elements of infrastructure, which is disk storage. And what was announced in terms of disk storage that's become generally available is the Premium SSD version 2. And if you're running infrastructure in Azure today, then more than likely you have probably some infrastructure that runs on Premium SSD, gives a high throughput, high IOPS per gigabyte, essentially, of storage. Now, again, for some customers, that's still not sufficient. And we've introduced, and this has been around for a while, Ultra Disk. And now, essentially, Premium SSD v2 is something that kind of sits in between Ultra Disk and Premium SSD with a couple of additional benefits. One of the goals was to improve the price-performance ratio for Premium SSD version 2 versus the traditional Premium SSD. Now, it does have some limitations. Right now, the biggest one really is that you're not able to use a Premium SSD v2 disk as the operating system disk for a VM. So they can only be used as data disks, and that is similar to ultra disk, right? Ultra disk also can only be used as a data disk, not as an operating system disk. I've just listed there the performance limits. And the reason I've listed the performance limits there without including capacity is because you can scale them independently. So you, in a premium SSD v2, you no longer have to purchase additional capacity just because you want to get a higher level of performance. So you might have a relatively small disk, maybe let's say to store your databases, temp database, your database service, temp database. Right, so you don't need a lot of storage perhaps, but you want to have very performant storage. So you can now disconnect or decouple the performance from the storage capacity. And so the limits are there. So the maximum size limit is 64 terabits and 80,000 IOPS and about 1.2 gigabits per second of throughput. So that is gigabytes of throughput. So that's, that's quite significant. And then of course the usual techniques of being able, to combine disks in a VM and take advantage of even higher throughput is available as well. Okay, so that's one announcement that was related to storage. There's another announcement that is, certainly related, and that was the preview of Azure Elastic SAN. So SAN, storage area network, for those of us who don't live entirely with our heads in the clouds yet, is probably a very familiar term, very familiar foundational element in your on-premises infrastructure, right? Storage area network. And so what Azure Elastic SAN aims to do is to provide a storage area network capability in Azure that is fully managed. And so the big thing here is that this is going to leverage the iSCSI protocol, which of course is what you might also use on-prem for your SAN. And this is really the first time that we've offered, that I'm aware of at least, natively, first party, an iSCSI storage solution. Now, what's the big deal with that, right? Because I've just finished talking about, hey, we have this new premium SSD v2, you can use it as a data disk, you get great throughput, great performance, and if you combine multiple data disks, then you can get the throughput even higher by spreading the load across data disks. So why do we need a SAN? Why do we still need something that is separate from the virtual machine? Well, shared storage, of course, is something that comes to mind, but from a performance perspective, what also is important to understand is that when you provision a virtual machine, there are two types of bandwidth limitations on that virtual machine in Azure. One is the network bandwidth limitation, and the other one is the disk throughput limitation. And more often than not, the virtual machine network bandwidth limitation for the same SKU is going to be higher than the managed disk throughput limitation. So what you can essentially do is offload some of the some of the IOPS, right, and some of the bandwidth from the disk to the network. Okay, so that's a benefit from a performance perspective. And I realized my slide got a little messed up here. The word that is hidden by my little diagram is preview. So the target performance that Elastic SAN aims to or provides, I should say, during the preview phase is per SAN 2 million IOPS and 32 gigabytes per second. Now per volume the limits are lower, and again these are preview numbers, but the limits per volume are lower, so you can't out of a single volume get those kind of numbers. You get that total by running multiple volumes on the SAN, and of course all combined with a low number of milliseconds of latency. And here again, kind of similar to the Azure Premium v2 disk, is the capability of scaling storage, so adding storage without necessarily having to scale performance. I mean, you certainly could. You could choose to add storage and simultaneously scale performance. But in this case, you say, hey, I don't need more performance, but I need more storage. So you can choose to scale up your storage without scaling up your performance. So that's Elastic SAN. That is currently in preview, right? The preview announcement was there. If you'd like to try out the Elastic SAN, the instructions on signing up for the preview are on the blog link that I have. And hopefully you've noticed that on the slides, I had some short links for these services that I've covered so far. Okay, and so I'm well aware that we're nearing about the hour mark. I'm not going to run on for too much longer. There's a couple of other announcements that I thought were certainly relevant, so I'm going to go through these next few ones just a little bit more quickly. There have been a number of announcements around hybrid capabilities in Azure. So, in other words, managing or operating across clouds or on premises as well. So Azure Kubernetes Service hybrid deployment has some improvements, including in the GitHub's capability and in the deployment experience becoming consistent, right, between on-prem and the cloud by not just deploying Kubernetes on-prem, but actually the Azure Kubernetes service. In Azure Stack HCI, there's a couple of preview announcements there as well. One of them is that you'll now be able to take advantage of Azure Marketplace virtual machine images and deploy them to your on-prem Stack HCI. And finally, another thing is that if you need support from Microsoft for your Stack HCI, the Microsoft support will be able to provide remote assistance with your permission, of course, to your Stack HCI infrastructure. So I think that's potentially very valuable as well when you need some troubleshooting assistance. We also saw the general availability announcement of Azure Arc-enabled SQL. And so what this is all about, right, is about running your SQL servers on-prem or in other clouds, but managing them through Azure Arc, taking advantage of some of the automation capabilities that we have for SQL IS VMs in Azure. Very interestingly, to me, two things that stood out was the capability of now using Azure Active Directory single sign-on in your on-premises VMs. So when we think back, let's say about 10 years ago, when Azure SQL was first announced, you could only sign in to the SQL server using SQL authentication. Now, that's probably not ideal. So what was added at some point later on to the Azure SQL database and managed instance using Azure Active Directory. And then Azure SQL Managed Instance is also adding the capability of signing on with domain credentials with Azure Active Directory not Azure Active Directory, but Active Directory Kerberos credentials. Okay. Now, a very common request has been from customers looking for support to do multi-factor authentication to log in to their on-premises SQL servers. And this is exactly why this announcement is so meaningful, because when I can perform single sign-on to a SQL server using Azure Active Directory, that means that I can use Azure Active Directory multi-factor authentication to secure that login with a second factor. Now, the fact is that that is supported today for SQL Server 2022 only. Not for 2019 or prior versions, but of course, as we go forward, newer versions of SQL Server will be able to take advantage of that as well. And then secondly, what the general availability of Azure Arc-enabled SQL means is that you can now also take advantage of the capabilities of Defender for SQL for your on-premises virtual machines, specifically the vulnerability assessment and general best practices recommendations that come with Defender for SQL. Here's another brand new announcement for a brand new service. It is actually generally available, and that is the Nutanix Cloud Clusters. And I think one of the easiest ways to begin to grasp Nutanix Cloud Clusters is to compare it to the Azure VMware solution. So what is being announced here is that we have in our data centers, in our Azure regions, we actually have Nutanix private cloud clusters running on the bare metal of those servers. And then, of course, there's the Nutanix the Nutanix management tooling comes with that. And so what it enables you to do is, whether it's from a migration perspective or a scale-out perspective, it enables you to manage your infrastructure in the same way on-prem if you have Nutanix on-prem and in Azure with this Nutanix cloud clusters. So I don't know how many people here have Nutanix on-prem, but for those that do, this is probably a very valuable announcement. I had a couple of things that I thought are probably relevant for some. One is Kubernetes Fleet Manager, and it's exactly what you probably think it is. It enables you to manage your Kubernetes clusters at scale. There's also something called deployment environments. This is especially relevant for developer teams or test teams, where you can rapidly and in a controlled fashion spin up a dev or test environment based on Azure templates, and then of course tear it down again when you're finished. And then this is the last one that I have on the slide here, is very much developer oriented. That is Microsoft DevBox. And I would say, and again, this is largely my opinion, but the best way to describe this would be to say this is a mix of Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop, targeted specifically towards creating virtual machines with developer tooling baked in that can be assigned to developers based on the project that they're working on. So very, very interesting, in my opinion. The scope of relevancy may be a little bit less, perhaps, than some of the other announcements I covered in more detail. Okay, so I want to quickly cover a couple of Azure security items, and of course that's generally going to be centered around Defender for Cloud. So there have been three, again, in my opinion, significant announcements for Defender for Cloud. One of them is a new service, which is currently in preview, called Cloud Security Posture Management, or CSPM. Now, what CSPM does is enhancing and augmenting the Defender for Cloud capabilities by connecting the dots, connecting the signals and the recommendations and so on from different Azure and non-Azure services into a single integrated view. And the idea behind that is that it's going to reduce the number of recommendations that are being surfaced by being intelligent about it. And so it does that all the way from your DevOps infrastructure, GitHub or Azure DevOps, to the actual workloads that run through external attack surface management, connecting all of those signals and producing a single cohesive set of recommendations and an overall fewer of them. Then the other announcement, and you probably may have already seen this show up in your Azure environment, if you were using the Azure Security Benchmark, which was at version 3, that's now essentially become the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark. And this is probably important to call out. The version numbering has been reset, right? So what essentially was Azure Security Benchmark v3 has now become the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark v1. What's the big news around that? We didn't just change the name because of changing the name, but because to kind of reflect the cross-cloud capabilities of the security benchmark. So the security benchmark now no longer just is relevant for your Azure cloud, but also for AWS and Google Compute Cloud, or Google Compute Platform, excuse me. And then the final announcement around Defender for Cloud is, again, preview availability of Microsoft Defender for DevOps. And what it does, it enables you to connect your Azure environment and Defender for Cloud to GitHub and Azure DevOps repositories. And what's going to happen is it's going to scan those repositories, and it's going to look for vulnerabilities that you're exposed to, for example, by virtue of maybe vulnerable dependencies. It's also going to do secret scanning. So it's going to look to see if, presumably accidentally, someone checked and committed a secret into the repository. And it's going to present that in a single dashboard And so far, I know I haven't used a whole lot of screenshots. Perhaps I could have done a better job on that. But I thought for this one, it was worth just pulling up a quick screenshot as to what that would look like. I did use one of our stock images. And the reason I did that is because even though I'm not a great developer, I did not have a single sample repository of my own where I had 441 vulnerabilities. But in addition to vulnerabilities, it also, let's see here, there we go. In addition to finding vulnerabilities, like I said, it also looks for exposed secrets and other kinds of recommendations. And so it presents it to you in a single comprehensive dashboard. And you can certainly connect multiple GitHub organizations, multiple GitHub repositories, and multiple Azure DevOps organizations and repositories in this single view. And it'll scan everything for you. Okay, and then we have Microsoft Entra, right, which is our identity management suite containing Azure Active Directory and cloud, the Cloud SIM, and so on. And so a couple of things that I thought were worth highlighting was the upcoming, actually, I think it might be generally available now, of workload identities. And workload identities is a set of capabilities in Microsoft Entra that enables you to essentially manage your service principals better, more consistently through, for example, conducting access reviews. And so access reviews is I would say, hopefully, something that you do on a regular basis, maybe with the assistance of privileged identity management, to look at, hey, who are the users in my environment? What do they have access to? And do they still need that access? Now, workload identity, so service principals were often overlooked with that. And so one of the capabilities of this workload identities feature of Entra is to include those in access reviews and so on. The other one that I think is very important is the, and again, this is preview, this piece is conditional access authentication strengths. And so I think we all realize that in 2022, multi-factor authentication is an absolute must-have. However, we've probably also seen announcements, news stories about MFA fatigue, for example, right, whereby an attacker who obtains a password for one of your users keeps bombarding that user with MFA authentication prompts. And, you know, depending on the particular type of second factor, it can unfortunately be easy for a user to accidentally, approve the sign-in request instead of denying it. And so what that essentially means is that some authentication factors are stronger than other authentication factors. So in the latest capabilities of the Azure Active Directory Authenticator app, or the Microsoft Authenticator app, I should call it, we can turn on that you have to put a number match in, that you're going to display what the name of the application is that the user is trying to sign into, and also the geography where the request is originating from. So you can provide that additional information to your users to help them make a good decision whether to approve or reject that MFA request. And so that would make it a stronger authentication factor. Well, so now in conditional access, it's possible to say that some of your enterprise applications are such critical resources from a security perspective that you will require multi-factor authentication, but on top of that are going to say, I only want to allow these particular authentication factors to be valid, right? So none of the ones that might be easier, I don't want to use the word bypass, but might be easier for a user to accidentally approve. So those were two updates that stood out to me related to Microsoft Entra. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning, and I appreciate everyone bearing with me here for another minute or so, there were some Azure Data and AI announcements actually made at PASS Summit just this week, one of which is that SQL Server 2022 is now generally available. And as you've seen earlier, it's an interesting release because it has some tie-ins to Azure Active Directory, for example, to enable on-prem authentication with that. And finally, the announcement that was made today is that in Azure SQL Managed Instance, which of course is an Azure service, you can now expect to get start and stop functionality. And so that's huge, because when you would be stopping your Azure SQL Managed Instance, you would stop getting charged for the compute portion of the cost of the managed instance. And certainly, I think for dev test environments, that can be a huge boon to help you reduce your expenditures on that. Okay, I think I'm about out of breath, and I'm certainly out of slides. Again, I appreciate everyone's attendance and questions in the chat. It's very much appreciated. If you have any more questions, I welcome them at this time. And Bill, I will also turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Sven. Excellent job tonight. Thanks for pointing out some really important features in the whole tons of features that were announced at Ignite. So I think that's really, that was really great. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, the recording will be made available. We'll get it up there in a day or two. It'll be posted to the YouTube channel. And I'll send out a notice to the group that, you know, where it's posted, when it's posted. Okay, Sven, you're getting a lot of thanks, which is great. So from people.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks again to the audience. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen.
Okay, and I'm going to stop the recording at this point.